I talk about the schools a lot because that's where, children learn the most. That well, not really the most. You learn the most at home. But when it comes to, certain subjects, I wish that they would go into why certain groups were enslaved.
Yeah, that's what's good, y'all? It's the Demouchet REACT, and we're back with another video. Who we got today, C?
Today we're back with another American reaction. Super excited about this video, guys. If you're new to us and we're new to you, make sure you scroll down, hit that subscribe button, and turn on the post notification bell because we're on the road to 100K. And we cannot get there without you guys, all right? Join the family. Without further ado, let's get into the video.
All right. Black rednecks and
white liberals.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
The instrumental use of the history of slavery today also underlies the claim that slavery grew out of racism. For most of its long history, which includes most of the history of the human race, slavery was largely not the enslavement of racially different people, for the simple reason that only in recent centuries has either the technology or the wealth existed to go to another continent to get slaves and transport them en masse across an ocean. People were enslaved because they were vulnerable, not because of how they looked. The peoples of the Balkans...
Okay, so before he go into the Balkans, so I think the misconception behind the whole slavery is because here in the United States, when you think of slavery, you don't think anything past of the slavery that happened here, right? With us, it was blacks being enslaved by the whites. We were even enslaved by Indians. So I feel like that's why here in the United States, that's why we focus so much on this. Because when it comes to like the Balkan slavery and slavery everywhere else in the world, our history books don't focus on that.
That is sad.
Yeah, it is.
Sad.
And so that's why a large population of our people here have the misconception that slavery only happened here. Like, for instance, I would have loved to learn in school what happened in Jamaica.
I would really love to just learn about all of it. Like,
right.
It's like they kind of shadowed it, and then they like didn't really shed light over it. You know what I'm saying?
were enslaved by fellow Europeans, as well as by the peoples of the Middle East, for at least 6 centuries before the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere. Before the modern era, by and large, Europeans enslaved other Europeans, Asians enslaved other Asians, Africans enslaved other Africans, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Slavery was not based on race, much less on theories about race. Only relatively late in history did enslavement across race...
Slavery was not based on race, but of the theory about race. If you haven't met somebody before, how you know that the existence was there until you bump shoulders or landed your eyes on them? I think it was more so around the, simply the idea of another person.
I would love for, just the schools. I talk about the schools a lot because that's where, children learn the most. Well, not really the most. You learn the most at home. But when it comes to, certain subjects, I wish that they would go into why certain groups were enslaved.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
For those specific reasons.
That's a good way to look at it. Yeah.
I would love for them to go into that. But because of what's happening now, I don't see that happening here, at least.
Yeah.
Lines occur on such a scale as to promote an ideology of racism that outlasted the institution of slavery itself. Wherever a separate people were enslaved, they were disdained or despised, whether they were different by country, religion, caste, race, or tribe. In East Africa, The Maasai were feared slave raiders, and other African tribes, either alone or in conjunction with Arabs, enslaved their more vulnerable neighbors. As late as 1891, it was reported that Manyuema slavers had demoralized surrounding tribes, destroying crops, and famine reigned everywhere.
Oh yeah, they was doing all that.
Even in the early 20th century, Abyssinians were still raiding other Africans and carrying off slaves. It was 1922 before the British had gained sufficient control in Tanganyika to stamp out slavery there. Arabs were the leading slave raiders in East Africa, ranging over an area larger than all of Europe. The total number of slaves exported from East Africa during the 19th century has been estimated to be at least 2 million. The form in which the story of slavery has reached most people today has been along the lines of the best-selling book and widely watched television miniseries Roots by Alex Haley. Challenged on the historical accuracy of Roots, Haley said, "I tried to give my people a myth to live by." This instrumental use of history, or purported history, is open to the same objections as other instrumental myth-making.
Okay, so this is, when people talk about Alex Haley, I'm a historian, okay? When people talk about Alex Haley and how it was just a myth, I feel like they take just certain parts of an interview and without watching the whole interview.
Yeah, they never give the whole story.
Yes, so I encourage everyone to go find that interview and watch the whole interview.
Yeah. It's a good look.
So you can understand a little bit more of what he was saying.
Right, because his story, other than the actual visual that he gave y'all, is a whole new level of intellect. You know what I'm saying? Because once you put it on paper, it's like, and you put through the visual and everything, people get the idea of how things went down. But when you really hear the author himself, the one who actually put everything together and tells you a little more deep insight about it,
Right. And he didn't just write the book on his own. You know, it was a lot of people from here and Africa that had a part of his book. And, you know, the whole thing. So, although people may feel like, oh, the whole thing wasn't true, look what it did. Generations upon generations since the not just the book was made, but since the movie. Now, I wasn't really a big fan of the miniseries. No, it was the miniseries. I guess the remake of the miniseries. I wasn't a big fan of the remake of the miniseries, but we actually have the book. We have Roots and we have Queen. We have both parts of it.
Yeah.
And those two pieces of literature was monumental. That's why generations upon generations are able to look back at it and teach their children what we went through in this country because of that work of art. So put some respect on it, okay?
Yeah, I hope they never really come to a point in life where they just try to take that whole
cancel culture.
Yeah, they want to cancel it like as if it never existed.
Right.
That's a trick.
Right.
And we're gonna talk a little more about that. We probably might, but let's see what happens next.
Despite the impression created by Roots, during the era of the massive slave trade from West Africa, a white man was more likely to catch malaria in Africa than to catch slaves himself. The average life expectancy of a white man in the interior of sub-Saharan Africa at that time was less than 1 year. By and large, men from Europe or the Western Hemisphere came to the coasts of Africa, bought their slaves, and left as soon as possible. Even so, the death rates among the white crews of the ships carrying slaves to the Western Hemisphere were as high as the death rates among the slaves themselves. It was only much later, after quinine and other medical measures enabled Europeans to survive where there were tropical diseases, was it possible for them to invade Africa in force and establish empires there. But by then, the Atlantic slave trade had already been ended. During the era of that trade, Africa was largely ruled by Africans, who established the conditions under which slave sales took place. The crew of a slave ship was in no position to defy African rulers and their armies by going out across the land and capturing people willy-nilly. The stronger African peoples captured and enslaved the weaker peoples. The same pattern found over the centuries in Europe, Asia, the Western Hemisphere, and Polynesia. In Nyasaland, the Ngoni and Yao swaggered over and terrorized other tribes. In Uganda, the Baganda made life miserable for their neighbors. And the Nyoro and Hima of Anko enslaved Toro women and children.
Everybody was
The
doing
Tutsi
it.
dominated the Hutu in Rwanda. The Maasai lorded it over the Kikuyu and Kamba. And the latter, in turn, held the Indorobo in a kind of serfdom. It was precisely the fact that Europeans, except for the Portuguese, seldom participated in the raids that captured and enslaved Africans that enabled most people in Europe and the Americas to remain oblivious to the traumatic experience that this was, with some Africans committing suicide to avoid capture and wives being whipped as they tried to cling to their husbands or children. Historian David Breon Davis pointed out that Europeans had little contact with the actual process of enslavement, and that, as late as 1721, the Royal African Company asked its agents to investigate the modes of enslavement in the interior. Europeans typically saw only the end results, enslaved people being offered for sale on the coast. It was much the same story in the Ottoman Empire, where those who bought slaves had no idea what these slaves had been through before. The unique position of the Western world in the history, and especially the destruction of slavery, need not imply that there was unanimity within the West on this institution. In addition to whites who defended the enslavement of Africans on racial grounds, or who opposed general emancipation on social grounds, there were many whites, and even blacks, who defended slavery as a matter of self-interest as slave owners.
Yep.
Although
in Louisiana. So, this may be different depending on what part of Louisiana you were from, and especially because the education that I'm speaking on is over 2 decades old. But I am from New Orleans, grew up in New Orleans, had a New Orleans education up until, Katrina. Well, a little bit before Katrina. Anyway, so when we got to Louisiana history, we were taught Louisiana slavery history. So we knew about the black slave owners. But when you get into those topics of black slave owners, you can't have today's mindset listening to, they were black slave owners.
Yeah.
Think about it. If you got free,
oh gosh,
would you come back for me and our children?
Yeah, that's what they did.
Right. You will buy me and our children, and any children after that we have would be slaves.
Yeah, but you had to have your freedom papers. Like, I mean, and as you're just crossing all these fields and all these mansions, you have to show that you're a free slave.
Right. Not slave, free person.
Free person. Once was a slave, but you are now
color.
free. Right.
Yeah.
And as you going, because you're on a mission to go get your loved one, your family, your people, you feel me?
So that would make you a slave owner.
Oh, gosh.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
But you also got to think of it in these terms as well. Just like there's bad people. You know how we always say skin folk, not your kin folk?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Just like there's always, of any race, there's always people who you'll look at like you're not one of us. You cannot be a person who is for the advancement of your people.
Yeah, that's how you say it. Yeah.
So there was those free people of color who were slave owners.
But they had
who what?
Go ahead.
Who were slave owners, but they had bad intentions for it.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So it wasn't just the black people who were slave owners of their family. It was black people who was in the business just like anybody else was. But you also got to think about the time that they were in. They were trying to rise to the top, trying to be equal, but during that time there was no equality. They used slavery as a basis of what am I trying to say? The basis of, trying to rise in society.
Yeah.
So you got to think of what the cards that those people of that time were dealt.
I mean, you gotta be on a realistic level to even think about it though, because it's a blueprint, and as you can see, all the countries was trying to use the same blueprint. Some people was trying to be quick with it, capture people and leave, and then again, like when you're a slave and you become free, you don't have too many resources because there's nothing out there for you. You have to try to maintain what you have and do it how you're supposed to do it.
Right.
But some people just go back and be like, yeah, I'm gonna just do what I seen work.
Right.
Yeah.
It makes me think of the video we watched listening to the slaves when they were free, and it was like, what now? What do? We don't know how to be free.
I remember that.
You know, it's been so long. So you gotta you can't when we listen to things and when we come across information, we're quick to think of it with today's ideology, but you can't think of it that way. This was totally different people, a totally different time. They didn't have freedom, you know, so you gotta think of it that way. They did the best they could to survive that time.
Yeah, that's this is a sticky one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Most black owners of slaves in the United States were only nominal owners of members of their own families.
Ah, see?
There were thousands of other blacks in the antebellum South who were commercial slave owners, just like their white counterparts.
The blueprint.
An estimated 1/3 of the free persons of color in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of these slave owners volunteered to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Black slave owners were
Y'all need to look up the Native Guards. That's what they were called, Native Guards.
Yeah, and it was on the front line though, right?
Fought for slavery.
Yeah, that's cool.
I need to go see who y'all people are today. Who the people is? You know what's crazy? I was looking up one time. I was looking up like the last names of the slave owners. And so I saw some last names that was familiar to me. So I'm looking at they people on Instagram. Facebook. I'm looking up like
Facebook.
Was it you? Was your great uncle a slave owner?
Well, I mean, and again, that's a stick one because it's about like if you do a DNA test and it goes back to it, you hear what they have accomplished in such a time. It's kind of like side eye. You know what I'm saying? Because it's like, hold on, it wasn't free yet.
Right.
Wait a minute. You know what I'm saying? So,
that's
there's
why
a
your
deed.
family rich.
My family got a deed to land.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And not too many, you know, people that came from out of slavery was able to like really just obtain land like that. Because even whenever they was getting land, they was still like, you got to think about the racism was still there. So they was still getting, their crops was getting burned, their land, their houses and everything wasn't, like all that stuff was still happening. So it's like, who was really successful around that time? And why?
It was hard.
You know what I'm saying?
And you had to go against your people. So the title of this book was what? Black Rednecks and White Liberals?
Yeah.
I gotta go find this book.
Yeah.
This my type of writing, baby. Literature.
and more common in the Caribbean. In short, there were many defenders of slavery in the West, even in the 19th century. And outside the West, slavery was too widely accepted to require defense. No other nation ended slavery in the same way as the United States did, and few ended it after so short a struggle, as history is measured. How and why did slavery end in most of the world? There were two major processes. Over the centuries, as more and more territories around the world consolidated into nation-states with their own armies and navies, raiding those territories to capture and enslave the people who lived within them became more hazardous in itself, and also risked military retaliation against the countries from which the raiders came. Thus, more and more peoples became off-limits to slave raiders over time. Put differently, the areas which remained subject to slave raiding over the centuries were primarily those where the people lived in smaller or weaker societies. Such societies continued to exist where it was difficult, for geographic or other reasons, to consolidate large areas under one government. This was true of the Balkans, the backwaters of Asia, and much of sub-Saharan Africa. By the early modern era, sub-Saharan Africa, with its numerous and severe geographic handicaps, was one of the last remaining areas from which vast numbers of people could be enslaved.
Interesting.
Very, man. And
I like it.
The history, yo, that's 400 plus years, you feel me? And we don't even have a piece of the amount of information that can, like, just be, like, like it's just so much mouth dropping
Yes, it
information.
is.
Like it's just
It is.
we don't know it all, but there's some few things that we were taught in schools. There was a few
Mhm.
things that we did our research on and read upon, and yeah, that's some facts. That's
Yeah.
kind of like some pills that's hard to swallow.
Yeah, I've just always been, a person who just wanted to know. Like, even as a little girl,
Yeah, nothing
I
wrong with that.
remember asking my dad, like, Dad, how did we get here? Like, in this city? And instead of telling me, like, our family history,
Mm-hmm.
my dad started it off with, they took us and put us in the boat and we got
Yeah, yeah,
here.
yeah.
I don't know if that day he was just being, snarky or that's how he wanted to tell me. But I always remember that day. And from that day, I was about 4 years old. From that day, I've just always wanted to know the history of my people.
It's crazy though, cause you have it in the back of your mind the whole time, but the community wasn't like there wasn't even 100% with the knowledge of what happened in the past,
Exactly.
and that's kind of like basically the overshadowing it. Like they don't want you to know the amount of information that you need to know to
Right.
better yourself and help people understand how life operates and how it once was and how you can be a better person in such ways. Yeah, same with me. We was put on a boat,
Yeah.
pulled up, and yeah, was in chains. And
Yeah, it wasn't that easy.
that's how it went down.
It wasn't that easy. Like, just now that we're on a quest to know it all. Not
yeah.
know it all, but just when it comes to even learning about Africa, of course, we know it's a continent, but I mean it as a continent. When now that we're on a quest to learn about Africa, yes, we were taught about Nelson Mandela and all of that, but we were not taught that Africa was colonized. So in our minds, the go back to Africa term, what is it? Is it what y'all told us it was, or was it kingdoms and palaces? And it was. Like, even when you think of what is the place? The Benin Republic? The kingdom of Benin with the mounds and all of that. Just learning about that, like that is just so beautiful to me. Like, this was kingdoms and palaces, and everybody had a job in the family. Everybody knew what to do. Like, it was community. Like, we missed out on that.
Yeah.
Lord, we going into something totally different. Anyway,
I mean, bro, but it's a lot. It's a lot, and I want to be more informed about it because it's like the trick comes whenever you don't know something.
Yeah.
And then they can put a fast one over you.
Yeah.
So taking, slavery information away from the books, away from the televisions, out of the movies and everything, it kind of puts you back in the position to be tricked again.
Right, even further.
Especially how advanced it is now.
Right.
So it's like,
if we were strict in our educational system over two decades ago, imagine now with them taking that stuff out of school.
Yeah.
Like, they would be even further behind. That'll
be the last straw.
Right, last straw.
That'll be the last straw.
Yeah, so let us know an interesting fact about, slavery here or wherever you are that is not as known as other parts of, slave history.
Yeah.
Our family on the channel would love to know.
Yeah.
So like this video, subscribe, turn on the post notification bell. We have enabled our super thanks if you like to support the channel that way, as well as our reaction request link is in the description box for you to send in your reaction requests. All right, we'll see you soon.
Peace.